or good afternoon to some of you. I see that there's a bunch of people calling in from around the world, which is awesome to see. Huge shout out to UXPin for making this space available to us to learn from each other, learn more about design systems and about our industry in general. It's an amazing place to learn that stuff. My name is Jess Clark, as she mentioned, and I'm here on behalf of the LinkedIn Design Systems team to tell a little bit about our story. So today we're going to talk about evolving your design system through people, product, and process. So to kick it off, just a little bit about me. I started at LinkedIn in 2010 as the front desk receptionist. At that time, I was taking phone calls and helping check people in while I was going to design school. From there, I became the first summer design intern here at LinkedIn. And the rest is kind of history. Worked on things like brand and marketing, mobile redesign, now leading the design systems team here. So it's been an amazing experience. Something that we do here at LinkedIn as a tradition is we ask people to share something not on their LinkedIn profile. So I'm going to do that as well. So in 5th grade, Mrs. Nelson, she gave everyone in the class an award at the end of the year. She gave me her ability to count my mistakes all year. It's not the most prestigious award, but I also wasn't the most focused kid. So towards the beginning of the year, she saw I was struggling. She slapped a paper on my desk and said, hey, you know what? Why don't you just count my mistakes? Tally them up. Good call, Mrs. Nelson, good call. She tricked me into learning, and I've loved learning ever since. So let's get started. If I lose you at any part of the process, feel free to tally to stay focused. So today we're going to walk through the 4 stages of a design system. We'll start with the early days, move into the toddler years, the tween years, and then all grown up. From here, we'll talk about how people, product, and process are the pillars of success to implementing a design system at your company. Maturity can mean different things for different companies. The scope and size of your design system really depends on your company, your need, your users. So definitely think about that throughout this process, that you might not need to hit all of these different stages of the system. But any stage you're in, we all know a design system takes tons of grit, talent, and relentless optimism to implement at a company. So like I mentioned, we're going to be kind of seeing this through the lens of LinkedIn, which is where I've experienced building a design system. So we're going to take that throughout the story the whole time. Let's kick it off with how our team is made up. So I lead the design systems team here, which comprises of the design side of the house. We work really closely with our Hue partners, which are the engineering side of the house. So at LinkedIn, the engineers and the designers are in different orgs, but our teams work super closely to create Art Deco and support Art Deco, which is our current design system. Our mission is to enable quality design and development at scale. We truly see Art Deco as our product, and our users are our designers and our engineers. So the current reach of our system, we support over 100 products, 150 designers, and 3,000 engineers. You might know about the consumer LinkedIn products, so web and the apps that we offer on iOS and Android, but we also offer tons of enterprise products for business to business. And as you know, LinkedIn's vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, which basically means tons of products and tons of people working on that. So though not every company might need every stage of this system, we need the whole kit and caboodle. So let's start with the early days. These are usually the days of messy beginnings. At LinkedIn, this starts in 2012. Every design systems will kind of start with this really messy beginning. So in 2003, our company launched, and in 2012, we undertook the first major redesign of LinkedIn. This is where we start to see those patterns taking place. Basically, with the first major redesign, a lot of times companies will start creating these systems. Once you start doing a big overhaul like this, it's a great time to piggyback on a redesign to launch a system. One of the main things for that is that engineers are already building the thing, and you already have resources dedicated. So taking those resources and applying it to creating consistency is a really great way to get your system off the ground. So we're going to start with people in the people product process. We actually called this Katie, the redesign of LinkedIn. You can look it up. It's a really great story since it was the first major redesign that we did in 2012, named after Katy Perry. At this point, the people that we had working on the system were a few designers and engineers working part-time. These designers and engineers were already working on products. So you can imagine they were working on homepage and other parts of the product where they were looking at creating this big redesign and seeing, hey, we can create really great consistency across a site. Let's get together and start building some of this stuff. It really started with a design initiative, so most of it was design patterns at first. This quickly became full-time though. Back in the day, in 2012, the web development, the front-end engineers, actually sat under UED. So we were the same team, which gave us a really great ability to move resourcing. Moving on to the product, since we did launch with Katie, we started with a bunch of initial patterns, things like typography, global nav, global alerts, modals, buttons. This is a really great place to start for any system, looking at that low-hanging fruit and see what you can create consistency for across the site. We also picked a tool. Remember, this is 2012, so we decided on Photoshop. Back then, we actually had people still working in Fireworks as well. So at this point, it's really great in the early stage to say, you know what, we really need to decide on a tool across the board. Once you start creating patterns, sharing those across tools like Fireworks and Photoshop gets really difficult. So here's where we really landed on a tool, which is Photoshop. Like I mentioned, because we did have some engineering resources early on, we started tackling some of that front-end work. The styles that really were shown to the members, a lot of it was our brand stuff. So looking at this, our first delivery, if you will, for the product was things like Google spreadsheets, where we're sharing some of those hex colors so we can start seeing that consistency on the product. And process. In the early days, it is pretty messy, so I'd say our process was basically coffee and conversations, not much more than that. It's a really hard sell here in the beginning to start creating large meetings for the org, war rooms, things like that. This is really the time where you're just whiteboarding a ton, figuring out how you want to move forward from here, what you really need, and what you can be resourced for. So to recap, for the early days, what you might see in a team stage is some designers, maybe just design, maybe a little bit engineering, if your team starts stepping in on that. And then communication as the main part of your process, emails, having those large rooms where you're working out in public so people can come by and see what you're doing. And the big takeaway here is say it and then say it again. Communication helps your team establish goals, ownership, legitimacy. You can't over communicate anytime you're working on a design system, but in the beginning, it's super, super important. So if you have email, Slack, posters in the hallway, whatever you can do, the biggest thing when you're starting a system is to really talk about it with everyone. So before we move on to the next stage, I want to talk a little bit about those growing pains, because as you move from one stage to the other, you really need to figure out when it's time to do that. So when we're in that beginning stage, the growing pains we were feeling was peers were still duplicating work. We had some patterns out there in Photoshop. We were trying to share them on wikis and things like that, but work was still getting duplicated. Our system also wasn't reaching enough people. We do a ton here at LinkedIn, so we wanted to have a larger scope than what we were having, especially when it was more design only. And things are getting lost in translation between design and code. When you're trying to share files and trying to communicate with Google Docs with the engineers and web developers, there's still a lot of things getting lost there, and we wanted to make sure to tighten that up. So from there, we move on to the toddler years. These are years of tantrums, band-aids, and learning how to stand on your own 2 feet. I have a toddler at home myself, so I know what this is like. The emotions are pretty similar when you're going through this part of your design system. For LinkedIn, this was 2013 to 2015. It was a long 2 years of a bunch of stuff that we worked on. So just like the first stage, we actually piggybacked off of a redesign. In 2015, we started looking at something that we called Shift. There's some information about there as well if you'd like to know more about that. This was a really visual refresh that ended up actually mapping to a technical refresh as well. which is an amazing partnership between design and engineering. But it really started on the apps. A couple of apps that we had out, they were saying, hey, this is a new, really fresh look and feel that we want to go out with. So I started just thinking again, what does this mean for us? We already had Katie, which is an original system, but we really wanted more than that. So this is when we shifted into calling our system Art Deco. We were inspired by movements of art history. It also was pretty awesome that Deco can be rearranged to mean code. We really wanted to emphasize that this was a new stage for us. We weren't just focused on design. We wanted a really huge impact. We wanted to impact the code as well. So when you talk about people, at this point, we had all that stuff from Katie. So we were able to create a dedicated team of designers and engineers. I think it was around, I'd say like 4 to 6 people, maybe 6 to 10 if you include everyone. And we're going to also want a manager to start at this stage. Once you get a dedicated group, you really want a manager to come in, either a design manager and an engineering manager, or a manager cross-functional to really guide the way for what this next stage is going to look like. We also moved, if you've heard of Nathan Curtis, talks about the overlord model. In the beginning, we were a little bit of that overlord model, which is really necessary. You know, you really need a design leader with strong design decision-making ability to get your design system off the ground and into the air. At this point, we start moving into a more autonomous team. You know, having an overlord doesn't really build that culture of trust and autonomy and innovation. So we're moving into that team that kind of sits horizontally across the organization. And engineering partners are key to having a true impact to your members, your organization, and ultimately your bottom line. So this is definitely a stage where if you can get some engineers on your team and really make this happen in code, it can make a really huge impact. So for our product, this is when we started getting more detailed in that product. Some teams might be tempted to start on all platforms at the same time, but you quickly realize you need a whole lot of people and a whole lot of process to make that happen. So here we still focused on web. We took some of the inspiration from the mobile work that was doing, and we started focusing on the web here. So here we could see the typography starting to get a little bit into more detail, more foundational elements. We expanded that to larger pieces as well. So now we're starting to touch on what later is components, looking at modals, containers, header, action bars. This is when you really get into that Lego building pieces. So you have some of the foundations. We're looking at how they can combine together to make these larger pieces. We also started kind of creeping in on guidance, which is really important for a design system. So at this point, we didn't have, you know, fully fledged documentation, but we started talking about, okay, if we have these entities like circles and squares, when do you use what? So you might be able to give the design organization, you know, a file that has, hey, circles are entities now. But what does that mean for them and what do they do with that? So we really started building some of that too. You can also see that we moved to Illustrator from Photoshop. So that was a tool change in there as well. We also had some pretty crazy debates at this time. The infamous debate of 2015 was, do we go with 12 pixel padding or 16 pixel padding? You'll have some of these debates in this stage. They can get kind of emotional for designers, but you'll get through it. So they're really important conversations to have to make sure that you're building your system super consistently and so that it can scale. So we had these new apps launching with this new design style that we were starting with Art Deco. But there was an issue where a lot of products were still going to be behind. We already created this Katie library that had some CSS styling and style in the APIs, and we didn't want those products to fall behind. As we all know, sometimes some platforms take longer than others. So what we did to create a migration for them was that we created a theme. So we took everything that we had in Katie and we applied the Art Deco visual styling to that, launched a theme so that products could migrate before they might migrate technical stacks. So digging a little bit into what our code looks like at this point, we were offering stuff for web. So this is still a really old application infrastructure. It's still a style-only API for code with not really those detailed interactive components. The experience is definitely really heavy on the application side. They still had to, ingest these styles and create a lot of that back-end work. But at least we were seeing that visual consistency because of the styling. In this case, these can be misused. So you'll see in the next stage that we'll want to move away from this and move more into components. At this time, we were also a design-led release. So designers would think, hey, this is a design we really want to introduce. We would launch it to the design team, and then the engineers would take that and start building it, and there'd be a little bit of a delay and a little bit of a check-in to make sure that designers could actually use it in code. So at this point, still design-led. We also, at this point, moved to Art Decify all the things. So we had this, migration theme, and we had a bunch of other stuff in place, apps rolling out. So the goal in this stage in our toddler years is really make sure everything looks the same, feels the same. So we started moving into this run, rep, rally process. So this is how we structured our design team. The run team is really responsible for the foundations, principles, documentation, making sure that we're managing those releases and communicating that to the org. The rep team was embedded. So if you know a little bit about Nathan Curtis's model, this is more of that strictly federated model where the rep team was actually out embedded into the product teams. So like I mentioned, we have a ton of different product teams. We had a few reps that covered consumer, enterprise. We had different locations. So we covered Sunnyvale, San Francisco, and these teams are really embedded to make sure that teams understood how they can migrate their designs over from the Katie look and feel to that Art Deco look and feel. And then Rally is the leadership team, folks that are making sure everything's running and getting resourced and going smoothly. So at this point for the process for our communication, we started creating wiki statuses. As you can see, this is where we're releasing Art Deco 1.5, so really, really early on. We also have email statuses. So this is out to the design team where we're explaining, hey, this is what's happening in Art Deco and design development, so people can stay up to date and make sure they're aware, especially with that delay in process I mentioned with design and engineering. We wanted everyone to be aware of what's coming out. Also, if you're reading the details of the notes, we brought donuts to a meeting. You can never go wrong with donuts. So here you see some of our process here where we moved away from that overlord model where we only had a few people in a room deciding what was going to happen with the system. And now you see meetings with, we have the VP of the user experience, we have the head of product design, we have design systems leads, and then we actually have those product teams coming in to share their work. So huge spaces where you're getting work up on the wall is great in this stage. This is where, you have a lot of stuff that may be still misaligned, but it's that time of bringing everything together and sharing your work with each other. So to recap on what that team stage looked like, you're adding engineers, adding a manager at this stage, adding one platform, adding some basic documentation. You saw with Katie and the Art Deco migration theme that we did have basic documentation. It wasn't necessarily fully designed documentation, more engineering documentation, but we had some. And then here in terms of process, you got to keep that communication, this builds, but you also need to start moving into collaboration. So you're trying to extend the team a little bit more and make sure you're learning a ton from all the other teams. So the takeaway from the toddler stage is run like mad and work with everyone. When your system starts to mature in this phase, the crazy kind of starts beginning. Your system will catch on, excitement will grow. You have this little corner of innovation. Now you're being overrun with requests. But it's really that time to learn as much as you can about the products you're serving. What you want to make sure you're doing is if you do have that team who's working on things, you're not losing touch with the real world and the real product. So moving on to those growing pains, at the end of the stage, we started hearing things like, what are you building towards? You guys are doing a lot of things. What's the goal here? What does that, what does that end look like? What does this fully fleshed library look like? And then also you're answering more questions and building less things. So at this point, when we had that model where we had folks really embedded in the product, they ended up doing things like answering questions all day long, taking people's files, flipping them for them, in Illustrator and making sure it got Art Deco-fied. And at this point, you start slowing down the innovation and actually building the library. Also, people might see you as the pattern police. It might be, at this stage, it was really governed. So moving from this stage to the next, you want to move from that governance, really strong governance, more into the empowerment, to empower the rest of the team to come along with you and help evolve the system as it goes. That governance might be needed in different stage. Like I said, with the toddler years, sometimes you're just trying to figure out who you are and kind of get up on your own feet. And to really create that consistency, you do need to say no. But this is a stage where now things are pretty solid and you can move from just saying no to empowering others to participate. The tween years, rough times. Times of awkward mishaps, tons of change, and really learning who you really are. I don't know about you, but I went through 100 different phases between the ages of 10 and 14, and it looks a little bit the same when you talk about a design system. When you move into the tween years, you've had pretty good history. People are starting to trust you and really looking towards the future and what you're going to do. And a lot of times, a lot of change is coming because this is really the time where you're moving from creating something really simple to learning to scale. So at this point in our system, we added members to our team. So at least design and engineering was 10 plus at this point. Now you're going to want a strong DPM and TPM partner. So at this point, you've really come off like understanding who you are. There's a lot going on. You really need someone to help structure your organization, help you create process, and really prepare you to scale. So in terms of our product, we really started getting more formalized about breaking things up in pieces. So these are our foundations, which are the smallest indivisible parts of our design system. Here you see color, typography, icon, grid. A lot of these elements really map back to our brand elements. Then we had components. So now we're actually building components from multiple parts of our foundation. You start seeing here that the system's starting to look a little bit more mature. There's meaning behind our definitions and meaning behind how we deliver this. Here you see alerts, carousels, hover cards, drop downs. And in terms of tools, we actually implemented Craft. So we started sharing our design system with our organization through Craft, which made the workflow 100 times better. We heard from designers that, hey, this is like 3 times the speed I used to design. Having a plug-in to something that your team works in is really great. You also see that we're no longer Photoshop and we're no longer Illustrator, we are Sketch. And as you've seen, this is something that's happened only over a couple years. As we know, in the design industry, our tools are always changing. So it's definitely great to learn to adapt very quickly. And speaking of change and adapting very quickly, even though we loved Craft and what it was doing for us, we actually started investigating tools and found another tool that really supported our needs. So in this time, which was only about a year, we moved from Craft to Lingo. Lingo gives us the ability to have different kits, has a great search functionality, tagging functionality. You're able to sync some of the kits, drag and drop other things. We have, component kits, we have illustrative kits. So it was a really great tool for us to deliver our design system today. In our product, we developed formalized design guidance and development guidance. So here you see our guidance that the engineers and designers use at LinkedIn. So in this case, we actually got to these tween years and realized we don't have that much documentation. People were opening sketch files and really actually liked the extra stuff that we typed in there rather than just pulling and drag and dropping. So at this point, we actually kicked off last year with a 1-month-long war room where all of the designers in our design systems just cranked this stuff out. We sat there and developed templates, developed what we wanted to say, and just bumped it out in 1 month. This is really, really important. I think sometimes designers hesitate to write content or create extra documentation, but this is a huge key piece of your documentation to scale and to really be implemented correctly. So here you see a couple of the pieces in our documentation. We have like the design and web tabs there. We moved from that, if we have different languages, adding that as well. We have principles, construction, behaviors, examples, do and don't, things like that. And all of our components here are mapped to the things that we have in Lingo today. So designers are able to use Lingo to really plug and play with the overrides there. And if they want to learn more about how that actually interacts and works with each other, they come here. Towards the latter half of last year, we actually created this thing we call the comprehensive spec. This is an amazing way where we actually start getting into the detail of what we're doing. As you saw with the Illustrator specs or even the Photoshop specs before, the Photoshop specs were really flat. It was just, here's a banner. When you got to the Illustrator specs, we actually started mapping out, here are the pieces of this thing that comes together. Now, as we move into Sketch and move into the tween years, we create a comprehensive spec that really, really encourages inclusive design. And we move from thinking Art Deco is a product to each component is a product within itself, which has an experience within itself. So here you see we introduce things like detailed interaction and configuration guidance, detailed internationalization guidance. We are a global company, so making sure that all of the content on our site can adjust to different line heights, different languages, and things like that, RTL. And we do this so that our teams will get a bunch of this stuff for free, so we can really work for every member of the global workforce. Here you also see keyboard navigation. It can be different fidelities like you see here, but really encouraging the inclusion of assistive technology. So here on the left side, you see, how do I use the keyboard to tab through this carousel? And on the right side here, you see super detailed flow charts that we need to create for some components that are really, really complex. In terms of code, this is when we actually start moving into components. So we start introducing things like Ember versions of our library where people can ingest the full experience. So we're not talking about taking a CSS styling and just creating visual styling across the product, which is a great win. We're actually going a whole level deeper here where we're saying, hey, now you can ingest this component, which is actually a product, and get all the goodness there. It's a lot harder to misuse, and we can bake in accessibility, content awareness, and all of that. You'll see here on the side, I kind of put these iOS and Android icons. At this point, we weren't expanding to the platform, but it's definitely top of mind. We're hearing a lot about it because we do have products across iOS and Android. We also moved to an engineering-led release schedule, which was a great improvement. Before, like I mentioned, design would need something, we'd push it out, and then engineering would kind of follow. In this case, now we work very closely with our engineers. We make sure that they're releasing this at the same time that we're communicating it out. So when they release, we tell the design organization, this is now out at this version. Depending on where your product is, this may or may not be available. And we can align those numbers and those releases so everyone is super clear. Early on in the process, it's a little bit confusing for designers to know, what release is my product on versus what kit you gave me. In terms of process, now we're moving to this Guru Guild guide model. As you can tell, we like alliteration here at LinkedIn. So this is moving away from that run, rep, rally model. And this is when I talk about that empowerment. So for the Guru here, this is a design systems designer, someone on our team who participates in all of the weekly design reviews. So in those reviews, they're providing insight on existing components and also noting future pattern opportunities. So, while they're in review, if anyone has any questions, they're there to answer it. But they're also there to see proactively into the future, hey, we're seeing this pattern is really common. We should probably get these people in a room, or tell those people and empower them, you guys should get in a room and make sure this is consistent. For the guild, this goes back to that centralized and federated model. So now our team is really centralized because we took people away from being embedded. And now we're including that federated model where we actually have product designers throughout the organization in this guild. So they're distributed on all their different products, all their different offices, competing objectives, and we all work together to create that one cohesive product experience. So we have about 15 to 17 designers in there now, and we meet bi-weekly, and we basically go over, hey, what's going on? We give them updates. They might tell us updates, and then we'll review any patterns and components there too. So for the guide, these are systems designers who answer quick questions about Art Deco, foundations, and components on Slack. So we have a Slack channel open. If a designer can't find something, we really encourage them to go to the documentation first, and then the Slack channel second. This is really helping you scale. Like I mentioned before, when you are embedded or you're having a lot of one-on-one conversations, we have about 6 folks on our teams right now to 150 designers. 6 to 150, is a hard sell here when you're trying to talk one-on-one with people. So by assigning people to the Slack channel, we're able to create space to keep building. Organization. As I mentioned, before in this process, you really want to have a strong DPM or TPM partner. Ours is amazing. So in this case, we actually introduced Airtable at this point. So we got on a really great cadence where we're aligned with our engineering team. So we're doing 2-week design sprints, we're assigning components, different other tickets or updates that might be needed, and we're working together on those and running forward. At this point, remember, like, you're running a product as a system, and people are going to want to know, what's your roadmap? People are starting to count on you. So what's your roadmap? You need to be held accountable for goals and progress. You need to be able to make sure you have accurate resourcing to hit your targets. So tracking things really accurately is really great at this stage. Making it public is even better. If you can make this public to your organization, it's amazing to see how much influence you can have when people really understand where you're trying to go. And then process, 2016 and 2017 were huge years for our team. We saw productivity and our impact really skyrocket by investing a ton of time and energy and making sure that we were using the right product and process to scale. So the year in 2016, we started out with war rooms, whiteboard sessions to define scope. We got the question a lot, what is a pattern? What isn't a pattern? So spending a lot of time on that. As you can see here, we were calling things whatchamacallit still. And we really ended our time in the tween years with consistent, notable communication to our entire UED org. We moved from trying to figure out who we were in kind of that messy, awkward stage with a lot of people kind of wondering who we were too, to really ending it with a secure identity and where we want to go and who we are as a system, what we want to take on, what we don't, and being able to communicate updates in a really effective way throughout our whole organization. So here you'll see in the tween years, DPM, TPM, focusing on tools and how important it is, those delivery mechanisms for your users, which are your designers and engineers, and still keeping that communication and collaboration, but moving into that coordination phase. So making sure that you're running a tight ship. And the takeaway here, embrace change and prepare to scale. As your team's influence and output grows, you're going to find out that your old ways just don't cut it anymore. The collaboration won't scale, the tools won't scale, and I think making space for your team to continue to do the best work is super important. Change is hard, it can be awkward, there might be moments where you might be misunderstood by the organization, but if you can really hang through this stage and embrace that change, you can really set yourself up to be a strong influence in your company and scale with your company as well. So the growing pains at this point, you might see that your backlog is at capacity. Everyone knows who you are now. Everyone knows what you're doing. Your calendar might be full. Everyone wants to meet with you. You're constantly fielding questions about cross-platform support. So, you have a super strong platform, whatever platform you started with, wherever your members are for your product. Your designers and engineers start saying, hey, what about the other platforms? What do I do here? Your peers want to create larger patterns and frameworks. So you might be saying no because you were at the stage of really prioritizing because you're like, this is what we do and this is what we don't do. You might start hearing from your peers, we want you to do that. So what do you do in that case? How do you manage that? So we started really feeling that towards the end of last year, which moves us into being all grown up. And a caveat, all grown up for us starts probably towards the end of last year and moving into 2018. So we were just starting on this journey. The years of empowerment and confidence, growing influence, a lot of great perks of being grown up. So now we're really starting to see what that stage looks like for us here at LinkedIn. So in terms of people, this is when you start having expanded platform team. So we're starting to include iOS and Android folks. Also in terms of QA, which is really great, looking at that, UX writing and more. So like I said, we're just starting this. So we started kind of partnering with iOS and Android and really looking to the future and these different kinds of specialties that we can start to include, Illustrator, things like that. You may even grow your team large enough to start splitting by task. I know some companies start splitting by support, creation, documentation. We're not there yet. We're still one team working on the platform, but adding these specialties for people. So for product, the end of last year and this year, we basically spent 2 quarters creating these comprehensive specs for the iOS and Android platforms. So we were hearing very loud and clear that we want consistency across all of our products and platforms, and we want to be able to do this through Art Deco. So the team crushed it at the end of last year and beginning of this year, and we basically took all of the web components we had and made sure that we had alignment on iOS and Android and created these comprehensive specs for that. We're still in the process of engineering all the solutions, but really made tons of progress on the design front. This can be a whole talk in itself, and I can't go into detail today because, as I'm sure you know, it's a really difficult time to explore. If you start going iOS and Android, there's already the existing HIG and material design guidelines. So when do you go native, and when do you go, brand oriented? When are we Art Deco? When are we iOS? When are we Android? Those are really big questions. Like I mentioned, can be a talk onto itself, but it's really worth it and something necessary if you want to establish your brand on iOS and Android as well. And as you can see, we're also doubling down on internationalization, assistive technology, and everything that's included, working with what iOS and Android have to offer there. We're also introducing gadgets, go gadgets. So we have foundations and components. So we're actually looking into gadgets now. So gadgets are actually built for products by products from multiple components. So in terms of Art Deco, we own the foundations and components, and we're going to continue owning that and evolving that. But we're actually working with, like I said, the empowerment there, working with the product team to start creating these larger pieces for themselves. In this case, they will be the owner of these pieces, as they'll basically be larger pieces. There'll be larger pieces of those foundations and components put together. Also with this, we're looking at tooling. So we're going to be taking those gadgets and putting them into Lingo. As you saw, we deliver Art Deco through Lingo. So we're going to be able to empower the teams to share it as well. So if the consumer team or the enterprise team wants to create a library of these coded larger gadgets, which include more data, interaction, and detail, then they can do that. They would own it from there in collaboration with us. And now with our product, we're in the process of adding that iOS and Android support. So you see here what that might look like with those decisions. Naming is a huge thing here. I don't know how many of you have tried to name different elements of a system. That also could probably be a talk within itself. So here you have a popover on iOS, which translates into a dropdown on web, which translates into a bottom sheet on Android. Different teams decide to go different ways with naming. We've decided to map to the engineering names. We do have designers who work across platform here at LinkedIn, but our engineers don't. And so we really wanted to partner with our engineers and to help speak their language. Speaking the same language is one of the strongest points of a design system, being able to communicate directly with your engineer. So we're going to do some work educating the design team on how to, how to call these different components on the different platforms. So in terms of process, just getting more detailed into this, this is our design and engineering team on design systems doing some road mapping for the year. This is when you start getting a little more sophisticated, creating maps of what do we want to stop doing, what do we want to start doing, what do we want to keep doing, what do we actually think 2018 looks like for us, what are the roadmaps of all the products, how can we align? Like I mentioned before, piggybacking on redesigns, it's always a great way. So it's always great to know the whole roadmap of your company, what's happening in your company, and how can your roadmap align to those pieces. And then more process. So like I mentioned with the gadgets, this is an example of a gadget workshop that we're running with product teams. So basically we're taking product teams and we're working with them to do a component cut up. Nathan Curtis kind of mentioned this as well. Do a component cut up where they take their product, cut it all up, put it all on the table, start moving those pieces around. This could be a 1 to 2 hour workshop with follow-up after that. So you start moving that stuff around, you start grouping them together, you start labeling, you might even cut again if things need to get smaller, and then you start prioritizing. What here can be consistent? What here is a gadget that we actually want to patternize? Because it's important to remember that if you are going to create a component out of it, it's something that you want to see duplicated. It's not something that you want to see innovated on very quickly. You want the pieces, and then you want to innovate on how you put those pieces together quickly. On the right side here is a picture of us doing an iconography workshop. So working with the different product teams with the guild, looking at all our UI icons. You know, are we being consistent? How are we using these across product? Do people agree we should take some stuff out? Is there any changes that need to be made? Like I mentioned with that bi-weekly guild meeting, this is where we really interact with the company, with the rest of the product teams to make sure that we're aligned and evolving together. So last takeaway, you know, as you're growing up and moving on, which really is a full-time role from here on out, empowering others and never stop listening. You know, we were all young once, so remember that you have a bunch of knowledge that other people in the company don't have. You have specialties that other people don't have, so empowering others, teaching them how to have a systems mindset, teaching them how to incorporate consistency and patterns into their products is really great. And then to never stop listening. No matter how old we get, we always have gaps in our knowledge and understanding, so just continuing to learn from each other, learning from your product teams. And so here we're going to revisit the key team stages. As I mentioned, when you're grown up, you're going to add a UX writer, maybe QA, Illustrator, and more. You might extend to more platforms. You might do product extensions like gadgets for us and more from there. And like I said, it's building, so tons of communication still, tons of collaboration, getting coordinated, and then really that contribution stage. So looking at how you can involve the rest of your company to evolve and power your system together. One way that our company does this is through that contribution model. So working with engineers and designers to also contribute back to the system. There are so many powerful and talented engineers and designers throughout your company that it's not only the systems team that can contribute to the system. So opening up your roadmap, opening up your JIRA tickets or your design needs to the rest of the company can really empower others to help you evolve the system and also just help your team scale. To revisit our key 3 takeaways, say it and say it again, run like mad, work with everyone, embrace change and prepare to scale, and empower others and never stop listening. Thank you. I think we're going to open it up to some Q&A.
Thank you, Jessica. That was awesome. It was great insight into LinkedIn and what you guys are doing with design systems. We do have a lot of questions here in the Q&A section, and we'll try to go through as many as possible. So first question I want to start out with is documentation. Is there anything that your team uses to document components for design systems? And if so, can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, so we actually, our original documentation was actually a prototype that came out of the redesign. So it was really interesting when we did that shift redesign, we created prototypes to make sure that we could show the executive team, hey, this is what we're doing. And from there, the documentation actually grew out of that prototype. The prototype was like an HTML prototype, and that really became the basis of our documentation because a lot of the components were in there, and so it really morphed. From there, you know, it's been just growing ever since. So it's something that we custom built with a left-hand rail that has all the components, and then has the 2 tabs. It has like the web tab and the design tab. We used the Ghost platform to write design documentation that got ingested into the site. Actually, right now we're underway of creating a whole new documentation site from the ground up. There's a lot of really great documentation out there that we've been inspired by, so we'd really like to build it from the ground up to make sure that you know, we can ingest things like live demos, and also just introduce the iOS and Android documentation. As you saw, it was just web. Now that we're moving into iOS and Android, we have a little bit of an IA problem where we really need to show a lot more there. So we are going to build ours custom, and our designers are actually getting into HTML to write that. So getting their hands dirty in the code a little bit, which is always really great to learn more about engineering, being on design systems team.
Definitely. And then following up to that, I know with this may be another talk. You mentioned like naming components. I know that it's an ongoing conversation. How do you close that gap whenever you're trying to name components and then also communicate that to the dev team?
Yeah, definitely. So we went, like I said, we went engineering led. Some folks go design led. So for example, we have a toast desktop. We call it a banner on iOS, and we call it a snack bar on Android. Some teams decided to just call it a toast across the board. We went engineering led first because a lot of these components have really common names for engineers, especially when you talk about engineers that work in Android and iOS. There are things already baked in that they're really kind of stuck on, and so trying to educate them is a whole like culture shift for them that we didn't want to have them do, especially when we have less designers than engineers, right? So when you think about scale, so we really decided to educate the designers. So what we did for naming was we created a fat spreadsheet. There's a lot of spreadsheets in design systems. Fat spreadsheet, listed all the web components we currently had, put iOS and Android, and we basically sat with those engineering teams and kind of showed them like, okay, we're going to map this. We need a component that does the same functionality. We looked at HIG and we looked at material design and said, do these things exist? What are they called? What do you guys call them? Because we're actually working on some tooling right now to make sure that we can automate speccing for our designers. And we want to make sure that if they can click on a component they drag in from Lingo, they can click on it and get the name that's actually in the code. The engineer receives that, totally understands the name, and things aren't getting lost in translation. So we go engineering led, get approval from the engineers on those naming, and then we map that for the designers on a spreadsheet, and also in our new documentation that we're designing, making it super clear for designers to know how to get from one to the other. And in Lingo that you can tag. So it might be something where there might be a common name that we think a designer would call it, and we'll tag it by that name so they can find it that way as well.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you for that. And when and how do you incorporate analytics? Do you do that at all with components? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. We've tried it from both ways. There's member research, and then there's also A/B testing. Member research we found is pretty difficult. You go out into the field and you're talking to members, but they don't really see things in pieces like we do. They see things as an experience. So we have done member research in terms of, it might be something a little bit stronger like iconography, where we just kind of piggyback on a product design research. So, if the feed team is going out and doing a research there, we say, okay, why don't we A/B test this component in your designs and see if the member reacts. Other than that, we do A/B testing in the product. So we ramp things up and see what's going on there. We always encourage our designers and engineers, if we have an existing component, use the existing component as A. And then if we want to explore a new component in that place, have that be the B. If we just launch the new component and we don't have that pure A/B testing, it's really difficult to know which component performed better and why. So we really count on the teams to have that A/B testing. And if they find that there's a component that works a lot better, then we'd love to use that information to evolve our components as well. Huge parts of that are also site speed and performance. Have a modal with like a super flashy blur that blurs the background and like has all this movement. You find out that it makes your product slower. You might have thought that the blur was a better experience, but slow is never a better experience for anyone. So we definitely take that stuff into consideration and address that in our components as well.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, looks like we have time for a couple more. Going back to the baby stage, what would be the main things or errors to avoid in structuring a team? Any advice for smaller teams like that?
Yeah, I'd say it's the people who are on it are really key. Having people who are kind of the best unicorns in your company. Also just those soft skills, because you're talking about a ton of collaboration and communication. So people that are really talented and really understand systems thinking, and you think from the ground up. Actually start with foundations. Sometimes it's hard to start with foundations, get them solid, and then go to components because everyone wants to do everything at once. Folks that can kind of start with foundations and move on. And also folks that are just really great at communicating, really effective collaborators, super open to feedback. Those are really key. You don't want to, get a bunch of folks in the room who aren't able to understand how it affects product. So I think that would be my advice there.
Okay, awesome. And this is going to be the last question, and we're going to jump to the grown-up stage that you were talking about. How how do you handle the source files and file collaboration in that stage?
Yeah, awesome. We've tried a couple different things. Right now, we decided to actually map our file structure to what's really happening. So we all have we have OneDrive. We're part of Microsoft now. If some of you don't know that, LinkedIn's part of Microsoft. So we're using OneDrive, and we have a couple of folders there. We have work in progress, and that's where all of our designers keep their work in progress folders. So if you're working on carousels, that's where it is. Then we have design complete, which maps to one of our stages. Like this spec is really great. It's ready to be design complete, ready to be picked up by dev. Then we have a folder that says in dev, and we move it when an engineer starts working on it, because there might be some adjustments as well. As you know, when you work with engineers, they might come back and tell you, hey, we can't do that. Luckily when you get to the grunt up stage, usually you're co-located and you're working so closely that happens a lot less often. In the beginning, it can happen a lot. And then we have the next file, which is code complete. So we move that file down to code complete, and then we actually type in the release number on it. So if that's 11.17.3, we type that on it. So our file structure always maps what's currently in code. So if we ever want to know when was that thing released, when was it last touched, it's there. So if someone takes something from code complete and they're going to work on it, we actually drag that back to their working folder. So we keep it's almost like we keep one file of each of the components. But what we do is in that design or that code complete section, we're snapshotting it every once in a while, so we don't lose the progress. We don't lose hey, what was it at 11.17.3. So yeah, that's how we organize our files. We make sure to make it as seamless as possible. So however we're doing our Airtable or Jira boards, trying to map that to how our files are structured.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you again for your time, and we're glad that everyone is able to join. This has been really insightful. We do have a talk at 10:30 with Ben from Airbnb, and we hope that you do stick around. Thank you again, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here.